Hello and welcome back to the second part of this tutorial. My name is Holo74 and I will be your coder for today. Or whatnot, I don't really care. Last time we were going over basic setup. I neglected to contribute the interface that we should have been using. Interfaces are sort of like abstract classes, and that you can put in functions and other classes that you derive that interface from are capable of using those functions. However, unlike a abstract class, abstract classes can contain variables, they can contain functions with a pre-made structures in them, and also they can be public, protected. Interfaces can only, to my knowledge, have public functions, and they cannot have variables, essentially. However, the good thing about the interfaces, instead of abstract classes, at least for C#, is that you can overlay multiple interfaces. Such as if I wanted an update interface, if I wanted a take damage interface, maybe not take damage because that's a bit more complex, but other interfaces. The first interface that we're going to create to link up with most of our stuff for players, because I personally don't like seeing a lot of mono behavior scripts or components on my player. However, I still need to update them or take input, which means I'm going to create an iUpdate, or updatable. Usually with interfaces, you put I before them to signify that this is an interface. It's code structure, it's not necessarily required, as interfaces can be named whatever you want, but for industry and practical reasons, or not necessarily practical, it's more of just a structure as everything else is. If you so wish to change that structure, then you'll be changing a lot more than just how your code style is, because to my knowledge, a lot of other people have this particular structure as well. So this is, we don't need any of these because we won't be deriving from anything. In this, we'll want a void update. The reason we're naming it update is essentially this is a update that's transferring from Unity's update into code update. The input general, or player controller, is also getting a bit, it will get exponentially big if we continue to do stuff like this. However, there's one common similarity between all of the code, the input generals, input handling, that essential code, or code that the similarity between all of this is it has to do with input. Essentially saying we could create a input handler and link it up with our controller, and it would be the same. However, it would clean up our player manager for other more important or more unique things for the player controller alone. Input handler. I am deriving this project from another project that I am currently working on. However, that doesn't necessarily matter right now. What does matter is, and this is one thing that I am very bad with, particularly when I am focused on other things such as recording or telling others how to code, is the namespace. again, with namespaces, depending on how descriptive you want to get or how many of them you want, will vary what you call it. Typically, I like to call my namespaces my user tag dot whatever, such as with a interface, I like to call it holo74 dot interface. Mainly because with interfaces, you will either be driving quite a few of them, or maybe just one of them. As far as I know, I've only really used interfaces as a one-off basis, but I'm also not the best programmer in the world. Now, saying that, we want to check to see, yeah. Holo74 dot, this is a handler dot walking handler. Handlers, you could essentially give them your own thing. Also with namespaces, it doesn't matter, so let's say we go into using holo74, it pulls up that. If I want to use a handler, if I derive from that, it will only pull things that have the namespace holo74.handler. However, to get a more specific, or to get a namespace that's more specific, you have to do walking handler. Essentially, when you go through something like this, it doesn't matter how many times, it doesn't matter how many times you add a dot, because the more times you add the dot, the more specific you'll have to get, and the more you'll have to write out saying using this type of code. The input general. Now we're going to be transferring over most of the player class, so it won't necessarily matter. Up in here, we'll also give this a namespace of holo74 dot handler. This one is, you could argue, well, for now I'll put it in a handler.input. Now we'll have to go up here, say using holo74.handler.walking handler. Yeah. While we are going to be using a walking handler, we're also going to be using interfaces. Kind of blinked on that one. So one thing that you can also do is, when you're creating a new version of this input handler, if you know for certain that you're going to be connecting it with, let's say, a player controller, and the player controller itself will have an array of updatables, then this is how I like to code it. I like to say public input handler, comma, player controller, main controller, using the player. Now with this, we can have a private player controller, main controller. We will, well, it's quite possible that we'll be referencing them, actually no, yes, we will be referencing the main controller quite a bit from the input handler. So I just like to get it here. And a interesting thing with this is, while we can do this, we can also say that, let's get rid of this, and in fact just get rid of the, well, we're going to be using start for some things. Input generals, we can take the input generals and put it up over here in the input handler, private input handler, and that we still want to have the player states. Well, we can still have the player states here. It's more efficient. Well, it's more organized, probably not more efficient, but to me it's more organized to have all my variables that are modular in one area. Such as if I'm going to be modifying the player state quite a bit, I'll have a separate script that handles how to give out the player state along with the key list. That is also another thing that it will require. However, we're still going to want the all input, simply because with this, not all the inputs will need to be hard coded. One of the things that I hate, and that a lot of other people probably hate, is hard coding in variables and floats or other things such as that. We'll want to take, actually we can probably just take the input handler itself and get rid of it from the update. Plonk it over here. Input handler. Or input handling. Main controller dot current state. Get all keys. We won't necessarily need this. Well, at least not this. Or not even any of these actually. So this needs to be public so that we can access it, and it also needs to be public simply because we'll be changing it throughout the game, and until we set up the script that handles how to change the state of a character, I'm going to leave it here for now. However, generally, it's not a very good idea to say, I'm just going to leave it for here, or here for now, because that never goes well. Most of the time it's better to do it right then and there, rather than putting it off, because when you put it off, it's unlikely that you're actually going to come back and do it, unless someone's hounding you, in which case, well, they're probably hounding you for a good reason. Let's see. In the updatable, we could also create a start function that whenever you launch a script from Unity Start, it'll run through all the updatables. I don't necessarily like to do that too much, but well, there are some benefits to it, because not everything, or this script won't be instantiated multiple times, whereas if you do a don't destroy on the player script, actually, it might not run the start function again. It'll only run, so the start function only runs when the character is loaded once, which typically only happens once per gameplay session. Alright, in the player controller, underneath the controller, we'll do a private list of updatables. The reason for this is, whoops, that's another thing that's another thing I'm not very consistent with either. Naming them all plural interfaces. Again, trust me now, naming them plural will save you so much hassle in the future. Oh, sure, why not? Remove all the unnecessaries. Not like I'll be doing stuff in the future. So with the iUpdatables, get input. When you start this, you'll say input generals 0 dot equals walking handler. If I would have waited a split second, then I wouldn't have to do this, but I jumped the gun, as they say. Let's see. No overload? Interesting. Walking handler. I could have sworn yeah. Forgot that as well. Whoops. Yeah. It should now take arguments. Are you not taking arguments? Main controller, and this one's going to be walking, so we'll do 0.5f. Oh, that's why. I forgot the new. Yeah. Now, when you start this up, you could essentially say the main controller right here. You could put this into a variables structure and have it return this. Essentially, we will be doing that later on, because I really don't like hard coding a lot of things or having most of my what are they called, variables spread out. It's very frustrating to me, at least. Get rid of that. Walking handler, or input general walking. Oh, okay. So when we created this, one of the fixes was, instead of importing, because I didn't have the new, it decided to make a new function which didn't accept anything. Now that makes a little bit more sense. It's very easy to just overlook something as simple as that. Now personally, I like to create the new list here. I have seen other people create the list inside of a start or awake function. Personally, I'm not entirely sure what the difference is, but I can probably say with certainty that the difference is small enough that no one has bothered to correct me. Let's see. Input handler. If you're going to have more than one input handler, which I would suggest not, it might not be a very good idea to name it exactly the same. But for now, we're just gonna have one, so it's completely and utterly fine. And like with this, it returns the current instance of the script that's running, or whatever. As long as it's not static, you can use this to get the script, which is nice. Now for the start, since we know for certain that most of our functions have gotten what they needed to get, we can do updatables.add input handler. The reason that the input handler accepts the updatables is because the input handler is a derivative of iUpdatable, which is nice because then we can go into the update function and just do for each double tap tab iUpdatable. I like to call it entity, but that's probably a horrible name. Updatable and updatables entity.update. Now that means with each iterator, this will run through, it will check, it will take these, or it'll run this. So each time that it goes through the for each loop, it will update this, which essentially is getting the input each update. Now that we have all that, I would say it's probably about time to create the functions, or not, the variables controller. Mod variables. You probably should have named that like mod player variables or something. This one won't be a derivative of anything because nothing's required to derive from it. We're not going to be updating the variables every update because there's nothing to update them with. Neither are we going to have them be a input general because there's no inputs. So for the run and walking speed, they're most likely going to be private. However, they will also probably be set when the game runs, meaning instead of having to come back into the code and wait for it to compile again, which gets immensely frustrating. I believe there's a way to create a struct, which when used properly, you can go into the inspector and there'll be a drop-down list where you can modify everything to your need. Float, run, speed, and walk speed. Then there'll be a private key code list, or not a list, an array. It's a static array because we're not adding inputs upon or when the game is on running. It's like having a gamepad or an Xbox controller, and midway through the game it's like, alright, now we're gonna play DDR. It's complete and utter nonsense, and if any game tells you to do that, drop it. Unless it's really fun. Or if it's Dark Souls. In which case, feel free to use whatever gamepad you so wish to use. You maniacs. Alright, now that we have all the keys, we have the run speed and walk speed. We'll probably also create mouse sensitivity as well, but we're not currently using the mouse. We should, however, because these tutorials are incredibly long. I do hope that someone's getting something out of these, because yeah. So the main controller with all the inputs, mod variables. Alright, so when we want this to be instantiated, we want the run speed, walk speed, and all the keys. I'm going to attempt this. I haven't attempted playing around with structures before. Let's see. Player info struct. This will be a first time, and if it doesn't immediately work out, then I will most definitely not continue on with it. But if it does, then that's all the better. Alright, so from what it seems, the variables, or the player struct, it works. It's actually very good. To get it to work, we need to have it be serializable. Essentially what serializable means is you're able to save it, I guess. All I know is whenever I'm saving to a JSON file, or if I need to edit a structure or class in the Unity editor, I have to make it serializable. I would say it essentially makes it so they can transfer between loading games. It's almost like saving in a way. So with that brilliant news out of the way, we no longer need the all inputs, nor do we need what was it? We don't need to create a float for run speed or walk speed. And let's see, we could probably put in the key list and player states as well. So let's go ahead and do that. This will shorten down the amount of code that we have in our player controller a significant amount, which is always brilliant to have. Let's see. Variable fields or structs. Let's see. I believe what this means is it cannot be like that. Yes. However, this is a public state. We could probably make it serializable or serialized field as well, meaning we'll have a default state for this. And instead of having it be public, we can just do a getter. Player state get current state. Unless we need more info, we can just say return current state. So now whenever we run this through, also I like to keep all my variables neat, sort of, sometimes. It all depends on whether I'm rushing or not. Then we can also go through and say we want to get a key code. And a specific key code. Get key. Or, yeah, get key. With this one, we'll input a key list, key type. The reason we're doing the list is instead of having to go through and say, oh, I want integer 0 or I want integer 1, we can do a key type or key list which is always defined. Such as we can do, I wouldn't necessarily recommend a switch statement. However, a switch statement might be a bit quicker than casting. So it's up to you, and I'll do both of them because why not? It's short enough right now. Which might be one reason why you, instead of using a switch statement, you might do a casting to an integer. If you're to do a switch statement, you might have like 13 keys. Because if you're using a keyboard or making a keyboard game, you're going to have quite a few controls. Now, if you're going to use a gamepad like an Xbox controller, essentially without the joysticks, you have 12. No, wait. 15 keys, which would mean that you would have to do a switch statement for each one of these, or yeah, each one of the key list of options. Then that doesn't there's actually a lot more. It's woefully underestimated how many there's actually. However, if you're doing something like mobile where you only have like 2 inputs, this might be better. But for now, I'm just going to do this. All keys int key type. This will cast and it will get us the correct key. Mod variables, input handler. Now this one doesn't necessarily like that we've gotten rid of everything. Alright, well, I'm probably going to leave this as a challenge. Try to fix the input handler through the player controller. There's essentially going to be a lot of the same type of thing. We're going to be doing something like this. And yes, this will be the challenge. I'll do it next time. I'll show you how I would do it. But you can't learn without actually participating, now can you? So that'll be it for this time. Next time, this time we went through and we've organized more of the code. Usually it's best, well, not necessarily best to refactor later on, because then you have a lot of going back and forth, and it's so much easier to just plan ahead for what you're wanting to do. So I hope you've learned something. Next time we'll probably be going over a lot more inputs. We'll be going through how to walk, or how I would set up walking, and if we have time, which if I cut out most of the creating of a list and going through and whatnot, then we'll probably have time to do something like a swimming handler, maybe changing between the two states, and that will be quite fun. Alright, well, with that swimming thing, I'll also show you how to set up water, essentially. Alright, with that, I'll see you all later. Have fun out there, code monkeys.